Silver energy ripped through the throne room air. It was a telekinetic blast meant to shatter bone and liquefy organs. Elias caught the HFY's strike with his bare hand. Beneath his skin, restructured cells converted the alien power into raw kinetic feedback. The air around his fist warped from the sudden thermal density. What happened next? I wish I could say the Dominion learned its lesson quietly. Stay close, because history is written by the survivors. 3 weeks earlier, his biggest problem was keeping his posture appropriately subservient while pretending not to understand the Aurelian dialect. The Great Convergence was an exercise in political theater dressed up as an interspecies pageant. Selim Prime's atmosphere was carefully regulated. It smelled faintly of ozone and crushed flora, a synthetic mixture designed to keep the high-tier species feeling invigorated and perpetually superior. At the center of this pageantry stood Archon Caliph Thorn. The entire ruling council expected her to select a vassal mate from a lineage of acceptable, dominant predators. She bypassed the Aurelian warlords. She ignored the bioluminescent Korjan nobles. A calculated insult. She chose a Terran. Elias stood slightly behind her left shoulder in the grand audience chamber. He kept his breathing shallow, and his shoulders slumped just enough to project Tier 9 vulnerability. The Dominion classified humans as utterly unremarkable. They were considered fragile biologicals from a backwater system, useful only for manual labor or low-tier administrative processing. Elias was supposed to be a diplomatic pet. He was meant to be a statement of Calith's absolute power, proving she was so secure in her position she could afford to tether herself to a weakling. It was the perfect cover. While Caliph held court, Elias kept his gaze directed downward. He fixed his attention on a slightly asymmetrical, brass-like clasp securing her ceremonial robe. The metal was polished to a flawless mirror finish. He didn't need to look up to see the room. In the curved reflection of that tiny clasp, he was tracking the patrol routes of the Korjan dreadguards pacing the high gallery behind them. For guards, 30-second rotation intervals. Heavy kinetic plating localized exclusively on their left flanks. He filed the data away while maintaining a look of dull, overwhelmed awe. Your pet seems easily exhausted, Archon. HFY Vaxen sneered from the adjacent obsidian dais. His voice carried the harmonic resonance typical of Aurelian elites, a sound specifically engineered to trigger biological compliance in lower species. Perhaps the atmospheric pressure is too much for his cellular density. He looks ready to collapse. Caliph didn't look back at Elias. He endures what he must, Vaxen. As do we all. Later, in the privacy of the Archon's secure quarters, the engineered dullness vanished from Elias's eyes. The pathetic slouch disappeared. He straightened his spine, aligning his posture with terrifying, predatory efficiency. Caliph turned from the window overlooking the capital. Vaxen is moving up the timetable. His extremists are isolating my loyalists in the outer sectors. I know, Elias said. His spoken Aurelian was flawless and entirely devoid of the thick, halting accent he used in public spaces. The dreadguards have changed their rotation patterns. They are no longer securing the perimeter. They are securing the exits. Caliph walked to the heavy oak table and paused. Lying open on the wood was a dense, leather-bound volume. It was the Vthari history text. The book was written in the old, complex syntax, a language strictly forbidden to Tier 9 species under penalty of immediate mind wipe. She looked at the book, then at Elias. You were reading this. I was cataloging their tactical failures, Elias replied softly. The Dominion erased the Vthari, but they kept the methodology. It was the terrible truth they shared in silence. The Dominion's benevolence was a myth. It was a velvet glove stretched tightly over a silent genocide. Caliph intended to break the system from the inside. To do that, she had needed a weapon the system couldn't detect. The Apex Protocol had provided one. Human DNA wasn't simply evolved through natural selection. It was a blueprint waiting for the right key to turn. Elias had undergone brutal, surgical precision modifications, unlocking genetic dormancy that turned ordinary muscle and bone into a highly adaptive biology. He was a ghost in their machine. The first physical test of that biology came 2 days later under the guise of a cultural exhibition. Vaxen insisted on it. He arranged a sparring match in the lower rings, ostensibly to demonstrate the evolutionary gap between the higher echelons and the mud dwellers. Elias was stripped to his trousers and thrown into the combat sand against a Korjan trainee. The arena was deafeningly loud and thick with the smell of sweat and charged particles. Elias let the Korjan hit him. A brutal backhand sent Elias sprawling into the dirt. The crowd, filled with lower-tier functionaries and Aurelian guards, laughed openly. Elias tasted copper. He stayed down for exactly 3 seconds. He breathed through the blinding pain, letting his highly sensitive nervous system map the kinetic force of the alien strike. The Korjan moved in for a crushing knee strike to the chest. The Korjan's center of gravity shifted a fraction too far left. No, the knee was the pivot. He was committing to the strike. Elias rolled late. He moved deliberately slow. The knee clipped his ribs, a glancing blow that still bruised bone, but it gave Elias the exact telemetry he needed. The Korjan's fast-twitch muscle fibers required a 0.4-second reset between heavy strikes. That was a massive, gaping window in a real fight. Elias coughed, spitting a mouthful of blood into the sand, and raised his hands in pathetic submission. The crowd jeered louder. Vaxon smiled from his elevated viewing box. Elias kept his head down, cataloging the combat data. Let them think he was broken. They invited a wolf into the garden, and the wolf was already calculating the distance to their throats. The political tension finally broke the night of the solar eclipse. The Soul Eater Network, the Dominion's ultimate planetary threat system, was powering down for a mandatory cycle refresh. The sprawling palace was plunged into artificial twilight. Elias was standing watch near Calith's study when the ambient temperature in the corridor dropped by several degrees. A low hum, then nothing. The climate control vent stopped. The silence was sudden and unnatural. Elias didn't draw a weapon, as he wasn't permitted to carry one, but his cellular structure began to shift rapidly. Microscopic adjustments flooded his cardiovascular system with adrenaline and oxygen. 12 elite guards poured into the corridor. Vaxon's extremists had come to remove the Archon. Elias stepped squarely into the center of the hallway. He didn't drop into a standard defensive stance. He just stood there, breathing evenly, his eyes tracking the micro-movements of the assassin's trigger fingers. The primitive facade dissolved completely, replaced by cold, terrifying stillness. The first Korjan guard fired a plasma caster from point-blank range. Elias didn't attempt to dodge the superheated bolt. He stepped precisely into the micro-vacuum created in its immediate wake. He seized the alien's wrist, twisting the joint past its mechanical limit, and used the massive guard's own forward momentum to drive the heavy kinetic plating directly into the jaw of the second attacker. It was pure mathematics. He operated entirely on angles, leverage, and velocity. The Aurelian visual cortex naturally processed images at roughly 60 frames per second. Elias was moving at a speed that left lagging ghost images in their optical fluid. He shattered a reinforced collarbone with a localized strike. He ruptured a secondary respiratory organ with 2 stiffened fingers. He dismantled 12 elite killers in exactly 4 seconds without once elevating his resting heart rate. Calith stood frozen in the doorway of her private study. Her breathing was shallow as she surveyed the broken bodies littering the carpet. Before she could process the violence, the corridor flooded with blinding, sterile white light. HFY Vaxon stepped through the perimeter breach, flanked by 3 dozen heavily armed loyalists carrying heavy suppression rifles. A biological weapon, Vaxon announced. His voice was artificially amplified to carry across the palace recording network. He pointed a jeweled gauntlet at the carnage. The Archon has imported an unregistered apex predator to butcher the ruling council. Secure the creature. If it resists, authorize immediate orbital bombardment on the Terran homeworld. Elias looked at Calith. A microscopic, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. He dropped to his knees and laced his fingers behind his head. The surrender was purely tactical. Fighting the reinforcements now would only validate Vaxon's lie and doom his entire species to glassing. He let the guards bind his wrists and drag him away by his hair. The containment block was located deep beneath the palace bedrock, built specifically for political prisoners the Dominion wanted the galaxy to permanently forget. They threw him into a spherical chamber lined with zero-point energy dampeners. The field was designed to completely suppress neural activity, rendering even the most powerful telekinetics inert and compliant. It felt like walking through deep, freezing water. The air was dead. The silence was absolute. Except for the vents. Elias sat in the dead center of the freezing floor, his eyes closed. He ignored the intense, burning sensation in his modified cells as his biology fought the aggressive suppression field. Instead, he listened. Deep inside the thick metallic walls, the palace climate control system maintained a low-frequency, rhythmic thrum. It was a mundane acoustic cycle, pushing synthetic air into the lower detention levels. Elias used that faint thrum as a metronome. The Aurelians firmly believed their technology was flawless, but energy always required a cycle refresh. The dampening grid cycles at a constant frequency of that micro-hesitation in the hum. It was a gap of exactly 3 milliseconds. A structural vulnerability completely invisible to anyone who wasn't explicitly bred to look for the cracks in the universe. While the Aurelian guard stood outside the reinforced containment door, debating whether the human biological weapon required oxygen or if they should simply vent the sector into the vacuum of space to save themselves the trouble, Elias was already calculating the exact tensile strength of the magnetic locks securing his wrists. He breathed in. The hum paused. He moved. The heavy magnetic locks shattered as Elias forced his hands apart in that microscopic window of dead energy. He didn't wait for the suppression field to re-engage. He drove his bare fist straight through the containment door's manual override panel, ripping the thick fiber optic cabling out by the roots. The security klaxons began to wail, a dissonant screech that echoed up the grand spiraling staircases. He ascended. He didn't bother trying to sneak. He walked a terrifyingly straight line toward the throne room, leaving a long trail of unconscious sentries and permanently warped blast doors in his wake. He breached the massive obsidian doors of the audience chamber just as Vaxon activated the central command console. The Soul Eater network hovered above the dais as a massive holographic projection, its crosshairs locked squarely on the distant Soul system. Terra was only minutes away from being turned into a dead cinder. "You are a plague," Vaxon screamed. His aristocratic composure was completely shattered by the sight of the blood-soaked human walking casually through his impenetrable security grid. And now, in the ruined center of the throne room, the air warped again. The High Exarch unleashed a telekinetic wave massive enough to level a city block. Elias didn't dodge. The silver energy slammed into him, the impact echoing through the vast chamber like a thunderclap. The science of human cellular density wasn't just about physical durability. It was an exercise in extreme kinetic absorption. When placed under catastrophic physical stress, the modified human skeletal structure didn't simply brace against impact. It acted as a highly efficient conductive matrix. Every joule of Vaxon's telekinetic hostility was actively drawn into Elias's muscle tissue, compressed into potential energy, and stored within the spaces between his reinforced cells. He wasn't resisting the attack. He was eating it. Elias stepped forward. The thermal density radiating from his body scorched the marble floor. He didn't strike Vaxon. He drove his glowing, overcharged fist directly into the Soul Eater command console. The feedback loop was instantaneous and violent. The stored telekinetic energy purged into the system architecture, melting the crystalline processors and permanently severing the orbital uplink. The holographic targeting reticle flickered and died. The weapon was permanently blind. The official report reclassified Terrans as Tier Unknown. On the high balcony, the wind smelled of rain and synthetic ozone. Elias stood perfectly still beside the Archon, watching the city lights. On the table behind them, the heavy Thari history text sat closed, the silent genocide finally exposed to the galaxy.